Hey everyone, it's Amit. So on September 4th, 2020, the CDC, or the Center for Disease Control, basically issued an eviction moratorium. And that eviction moratorium basically stated that landlords were unable to evict tenants who basically had back rent due to the global health crisis. And this eviction moratorium lasted until June 30th, 2021. Now, on June 24th, 2021, so 6 days prior to the lapsing of this eviction moratorium, the CDC basically came out and extended this eviction moratorium by an incremental month. So now this eviction moratorium is set to lapse on July 31st, 2021. In the meantime, when this was happening, the landlords basically had a whole tizzy, and they effectively raised a petition with the Supreme Court questioning the constitutionality of this extension to this moratorium by the CDC. And the Supreme Court basically ruled in a 5-4 judgment that they were going to effectively let this particular program, i.e. the eviction moratorium, continue until July 31st, 2020, to basically allow the states an opportunity to create the requisite infrastructure so that they can basically get checks out to tenants such that they can make their landlords whole. Now, this is quite often being viewed as a bit of a slap against the landlords. However, the Supreme Court did basically say that they did not view the CDC moratorium to be constitutional. The reason why that is quite relevant is because it would basically allude or reference the notion that the likelihood of an extension of this moratorium by the CDC beyond July 31st, 2021 is going to be largely an unlikely phenomenon. Now, granted, states may individually decide to extend the moratorium, but it would not be directly from the CDC, and several states have gone ahead and done so, such as California, New Jersey, New York, Maryland, Washington, D.C. So they've gone ahead and extended their moratorium until, in some cases, August or September of 2021. So then the general notion may be, well, how impactful is this really going to be? Is there going to be this significant spike in terms of the number of eviction requests that are put in through the court come August 1st of 2021? And the likely situation there is that it will be the case, okay? And the reason why I say that is that depending on the study that you look at, there's somewhere between 6 to 8 million households that basically owe back rent. And there is a high likelihood that several of them, the landlords may work with the tenant in order to achieve some level of middle ground. Because generally speaking, landlords do not want to entertain the eviction process, because the eviction process is a bit of a journey in itself, okay? It can take about 3 months, and this is prior to the global health crisis, to get an eviction order through. That means that they would get the request into the courts and get that tenant out. It would take about 3 months. But now we know that a lot of the court system is even backed up, right? There's a significant amount of delay in the procedural element of the court process, also due to the global health crisis, and therefore the eviction process will likely take a lot longer than 3 months. And by the way, this 3-month reference that I'm using is an average number. Absolutely granted that certain states such as Illinois, California, New York, etc., the duration to get that eviction out was a lot longer than what we're basically talking about here. In this video, what I want to specifically talk about is the following related to this eviction moratorium. What caused it, what the implications are thereof, and how this potentially impacts you, and what can potentially be done about it. But before I get too far into it, don't forget to smash that like button for the YouTube algorithm such that this video gets pumped out to lots of different people. And of course, while you're there, subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell, and let's get into it. Now, the fundamental notion to note here is this eviction moratorium was put in for all the right purposes, okay? However, it was implemented by the CDC, and therefore it didn't quite capture, the end-to-end, all the various nuts and nuances associated with imposing something such as significant as this. So some of the reasons in terms of why the CDC imposed this whole eviction moratorium are pretty clear, right? So they wanted to basically promote this whole self-isolation notification such that people could basically separate themselves during the global health crisis. They also want to get in front of employers that may potentially potentially be laying off employees, and therefore these employees would not necessarily have any funds to pay their rent. So they did want to provide some level of comfort around that and to prevent a significant spike in homelessness when you're also trying to push for this self-isolation type of mandate. And of course, there was this notion that several people may potentially be getting ill as a part of this whole global health crisis, and due to that, their income stream may potentially be impacted, due to which they would be unable to potentially pay their rent. Now, while the reasons for imposing the moratorium absolutely makes a lot of sense, the nuances with which the moratorium was imposed probably left a little bit more to be desired through the legislative process. Okay, so I'll give you a couple of examples in terms of that context. So for example, one of the reasons, or one of the ways they had basically come up and said is that, hey, you do not necessarily need to pay rent, but with that said, the amount of rent that you owe to your landlord is going to be added on or tacked on to the back end of your lease. Similarly, what they also said for landlords is that your mortgage that the landlord may potentially owe on that property is going to be deferred or tacked on to the back end of their particular mortgage. But what it did not take away from is that the landlords would still be responsible for any repair work that may be done on that property, as well as any property taxes they may potentially need to get paid, both of which can be quite significant when you're talking about several states that people live in, as well as the amount of damage and wear and tear that may go into a given property. So now you have this paradigm where landlords are effectively not receiving any money, but they are having to continue with the repairs and all of this additional work related to a given property, and that creates a significant cash crunch for landlords. And now I know there's sometimes a fundamental notion or this belief out there that a lot of the landlords are these big guys who effectively own lots and lots and lots of property, and they're not going to effectively be impacted because they have significant amount of cash flow. But that is not the reality. Most apartment buildings out there are actually mom and pop type of operations who run pretty tight, and they rely upon this rental income to basically get them through once their mortgages end, and that mortgage ending is usually aligned or coincides with their retirement plan. Okay, so it's resulting in a significant increase in the number of bankruptcies due to this very paradigm of this whole eviction moratorium. The other thing that has sort of like disenchanted the whole landlord population is due to the fact that the eviction moratorium is set to cover singles if their income level is under $99,000, and couples who live in a household, right, where the income limit is at $198,000. So if you're single and you make less than $99,000, or if you're married and you make less than $198,000, you could basically fall within the cover of this eviction moratorium. Now, I personally, and this is a bit of a tangent, I personally don't know when $198,000 became a significant issue or it's considered being poor for all intents and purposes, and yet the government has a significant amount of challenges in terms of raising minimum wages, but for that reason, I do digress. So there's several instances, right, where the landlords are obscenely ticked off with this whole process because there's no real way for them to validate a lot of these things either, right? There's no real way for landlords to basically validate that, hey, this given person or this given tenant, they have lost their jobs, or they're not going to be willing or able to pay, or these employees or these tenants, their income has dropped below that $198,000 number. So there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of the landlord's perspective in terms of, you know, are these folks actually employed gainfully so? And why is it that the CDC has basically extended the term of this whole eviction moratorium, albeit it's just for a month, even though there's a lot of favorable news from an employment numbers perspective as it relates to the overarching state of the economy. With all of that said, there have been programs that have basically been put in place, okay? So for example, Congress has basically earmarked some $46 billion in rental assistance as a part of the whole pandemic relief package, okay? So that program is effectively out there. However, the states have had a significant amount of issue giving this money out, and to date, only about $1 billion out of this $46 billion have actually made their way to tenants as well as eventually to landlords. And one of the main reasons why this is the fact pattern that there is because the application process in itself is somewhat convoluted, right? Because when you apply for any of this rental relief, if you will, then what you'd have to do is the tenant usually has to work in conjunction with the landlord, or the landlord may need to work in conjunction with the tenant in order to fill out this application that is then subsequently submitted. But it does require some level of conversation between the tenant and the landlord in order to execute this process. And once that application actually gets through, the states are not necessarily in a position where they have the infrastructure set up such that they can actually make the payments associated with any of this back rent. This is one of those things where Congress has actually acted appropriately in order to try to get funds out to landlords and to prevent a significant issue as it relates to evictions. But the fact of the matter is somebody keeps fumbling the ball, right? And in this particular instance, it appears that the states have fumbled the ball and are not able to get this money out to landlords eventually, such that they would not pursue the eviction process as significantly. Now, one way to prevent this whole thing from accelerating is, of course, if tenants and landlords were sort of like separated, right? And they had the ability to file for this petition to become eligible for this money separately, right? And they did not need to fill out these applications together. But the reality of it is at this stage, which is July 16, July 17, July 18th, to get through some kind of legislation or some type of process change by July 31st is likely a scenario that is not going to basically prevail, okay? So what can potentially happen, right? What are going to be the implications of it, and how could this thing potentially impact you? First thing to note, as is pretty obvious, is the number of evictions is going to go through the roof, which I've already talked about. But when you have the number of evictions going through the roof, it comes to those individuals who are actually being evicted, it doesn't necessarily impact their credit score, but what it does impact is when they go to rent their subsequent property, lots and lots of landlords, they actually run a rental screening report, and on that rental screening report, it does show that there were evictions on that particular tenant. And when you see that, you're likely not to rent that property out to that given individual or family. So there could be a spike in homelessness. And when you have a spike in homelessness, or you have all of these properties that are coming onto the market that are effectively not rented, it could be kind of a good thing because it would effectively drop some of these rental prices, okay? Because now you have an overt amount of supply, and the demand, assuming is fairly constant, it's going to drop some of the prices associated with all of this. Now, what's also happening in parallel, of course, is you have rising home prices, right? So when you have rising home prices, one of the best ways to basically combat something such as that is to effectively increase the amount of supply or to reduce the demand thereof, right? So one of those demand supply type of variables has to come down, which would effectively reduce the prices of home sales. But when you have more and more unoccupied rental properties due to the inability to potentially get people in them, because there's about 6 million people that are likely going to get evicted as a part of this whole process, what it's going to do is it's going to reduce the number of buyers for homes because they are not going to be necessarily renting those homes out, okay? So what it could potentially result in is a flatlining or a slow reduction in the prices of homes. Now, this would obviously take a lot longer to effectively manifest itself. It goes without saying, right? The pandemic or the global health crisis has definitely been significant, and it's definitely been very impactful for both landlords and tenants, right? And it's not necessary to say like which one's right or which one's wrong, but what are your thoughts in this matter? Do you think that there is going to be some level of change in policy over the next couple of weeks here? Include that in the comment below. And also, if you don't think there's going to be a significant spike in the number of evictions come August 1st, definitely include that in the comments below as well. As always, I hope you enjoyed the contents of this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell, and I'll of course see you in the next one.